With the second day of talks underway between leaders of the G7, the mood on Saturday was one of cautious optimism, led by French President Emmanuel Macron, hailing a revived partnership with United States President Joe Biden on matters of key interest.
I think it's great to have the US President part of the club and very willing to cooperate.
Throughout the day, Europe's leaders grouped together sharing pleasantries, with Boris Johnson even making a slight at European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's snub by Turkish President Recep Erdogan in April. But that didn't detract from the side issues of Brexit and the problems surrounding Northern Ireland's border arrangement in any future agreement between the UK and the EU.
To be fair, there's quite a lot of misunderstanding around the EU about the situation in Northern Ireland, the balance of the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, and I think that we'll have some pragmatic solutions. And if we don't, then I think that what our friends have also understood is that it's the prime duty of the UK government to uphold the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom.
The climate emergency also, meanwhile, remains high on the agenda. UN Chief Antonio Guterres touched down in Cornwall mid-afternoon to continue driving his message of a commitment to a sustainable global future, also calling for an increase in COVID vaccine access for poorer countries. It followed the announcement of a new G7 pandemic action plan aimed at eliminating waiting time on vaccine licensing and development, as well as cutting time on treatment and diagnostics to under 100 days of any future disease.
The white sands of Carbis Bay, idyllic power setting for a meeting of the Group of Seven described as the world's most advanced democracies. They're also leading the vaccine race to exit the pandemic, and while socially distanced still, they're face-to-face at least and promising a combined effort to help the world emerge from crisis.
I actually think this is a meeting that genuinely needs to happen, because we need to make sure that we learn the lessons from the pandemic. We need to make sure that we don't repeat some of the errors that we doubtless made in the course of the last 18 months or so. And we need to make sure that we now allow our economies to recover.
The headline pledge on this opening day of the G7 is the donation of 1 billion vaccine doses to lower and middle-income countries over the next 12 months, with the US offering half of that amount. Campaigners say it's nowhere near enough and nowhere near fast enough.
I think 1 billion doses is a good thing. I mean, you can't say it's a bad thing, but we need 11 billion doses, and we need to move away from the idea of charity crumbs from the rich countries and let developing countries like South Africa, India produce their own vaccines. And the only way to do that is to share the vaccine recipe and break through the monopolies of these big pharma corporations. And Boris Johnson really doesn't want to do that. So he wants us all to talk about donations and the largesse of the richest nations, when in fact they're being hugely selfish and putting profit over people.
But now's the age of consumerism, fossil fuel addiction, single-use affliction.
Protesters are being kept well away from the summit venue, but for once the issues they raise are actually being discussed. There's pressure to waive patents so that poorer countries can develop vaccines for themselves. The US and France are in favour, with others yet to follow. Climate and inequality are among the world's crises that will top the agenda on Sunday. They call it the G7, but really there's no doubt who the two leading figures are here. Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister and host, keen to show his country off as a global power player post-Brexit. And Joe Biden, of course, the US President on his first foreign visit. Both men keen to be seen at the helm of efforts to rid the world of climate change and the pandemic. What emerges from this meeting? A post-Trump consensus, alliances reinvigorated, meaningful promises of action will determine whether this wealthy club of nations can make a real difference. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Cornwall.
The CDC is holding an emergency meeting next week after reports of extremely rare heart inflammation following doses of the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. The CDC says it has identified at least 226 cases of myocarditis and pericarditis in people aged 30 and younger who received a Pfizer or Moderna vaccine.
There's two main things to keep in mind about this legislation. One is that it's not just going to show your vaccination status, it will also show whether you've received a negative test result in the past days and whether you have ever been diagnosed with coronavirus before, therefore giving you antibodies. And EU countries, under this legislation that's been agreed, must allow in an EU citizen that has one of those three things. In other words, an EU country cannot block an EU citizen from entering if they haven't been vaccinated. It has to allow them to get a test and or quarantine and still come in. The other important thing to note is that this is a minimum requirement. So under this legislation, all EU countries must accept this vaccine passport. But they could let people in with other pieces of information, or they could not require anything for a citizen to come in. And this may become important because the passport will only recognize European Medicines Agency approved vaccines. That is Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson. Now, only one EU country has given a different vaccine that's been authorized by the EMA. That is Hungary. They've been giving out the Sputnik vaccine. That will not show up on this EU vaccine passport. However, countries would still be free to allow Hungarians who have been Sputnik vaccinated into their countries. There's nothing blocking that. This is basically a minimum criteria. The main design here is to reopen travel within the EU and get tourism going again.
Well, earlier today, G7 leaders also unveiled some US-led plans to counter China's growing influence in developing nations. France 24 Sanam Chantier tells us more about what's been coined a strategic competition against China.
It's a central topic, and it's a rather contentious one, certainly behind the closed curtains. I want you and the viewers to cast your mind back to several weeks before Joe Biden was sworn in as the US president. At the time, Emmanuel Macron was at the helm of this campaign to push the European Union to sign these investment deals with Beijing when Biden's team had made it rather clear that he wanted the bloc to hold back. Additionally, we know that Joe Biden has gone into the summit with this idea, with this hope to, as you mentioned, to get the global, the international community to scale back and to see whether they can cooperate less with Beijing to bring down its influence on the global stage. Just to give you an idea of how much its sphere has grown, back in 1979, China's economy was smaller than that of Italy's. Today, it's the second biggest economy in the world. So get your mind around that if you can. So here we are today. The G7 leaders have signed this declaration. They're looking at this initiative that will oppose China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is sort of spanning across several continents, from 8 continents, even from Asia to Africa to South America and, of course, parts of Europe. And 100 countries or so have signed up to this. But it's one that's been widely criticized because a lot of countries, certainly the smaller ones, are now having to deal with hefty, unmanageable debt. So out of this, we have this rather catchy, alliterative name, this project that's been inspired by the US, the Build Back Better World, also known as the B3W drive for obvious reasons. And according to the White House, it's a bid to meet the need for infrastructure in low and middle income countries. And it doesn't come as much of a surprise, given that Joe Biden had published this opinions piece at early in June in the Washington Post, I believe, saying that that's exactly what they want to do. They want to create an alternative plan to that of China.
Can you hear me? It's Annette Young here in Paris. I just wanted to know, how bad is the situation in Tigray?
Unlike anything we've seen for a decade, Annette, it is more than 250,000 people in what we would call, in a terminology, catastrophic food insecurity. So it was already bad 6-7 weeks ago in terms of what people had endured, having to leave under conflict and people being killed. Now we have got that worst case scenario, which agencies like UNICEF have been warning about for a long time, when millions of people have to flee and leave their homes and crops and livestock.
But first, more than 7,000 people have fled northern Burkina Faso in the wake of the most deadly massacre the country suffered in recent years. At least 160 people were killed in the village of Solhan on Saturday after gunmen stormed the community. Since 2015, Burkina Faso's faced mounting violence from armed extremists, which has forced more than 1.2 million people from their homes over the last 2 years alone.
Still shaken, survivors in Solhan recover in one of the region's hospitals after the deadliest attack in Burkina Faso in the last few years.
Ce n'était pas en tout cas facile. C'était vraiment lamentable parce que trop de dégâts. Ils ont trop tué sans trier, ni femmes, ni enfants. Bon, ils ont tué, ils ont brûlé. Tous les biens qu'ils ont vus, en tout cas, ils ont saccagé.
On Friday night, armed men launched an assault on the village, killing at least 160 people. The attack is yet to have been claimed. Many have criticised authorities for not responding quickly enough. During a visit to Solhan on Monday, the country's Prime Minister vowed to improve security.
Nous allons nous réorganiser pour pouvoir apporter la réponse appropriée à la situation. Cette incurie que nous constatons aujourd'hui ne restera pas impunie.
Solhan is located in the so-called free border zone in the Sahel, a region which has been repeatedly hit by jihadist attacks. Over the past 6 years, authorities have tried to clear the area of militants, but the attacks have become more frequent and deadly. Since 2015, more than 1,400 people have been killed and more than 1 million displaced.
It's a good day for Esther Hagos and Hassan. They've just received their share of relief food brought in by the United Nations World Food Programme. It's the first delivery of aid they've received in months. Esther and her family are among millions of Ethiopians displaced by the conflict in Tigray region. The family is sheltering in an abandoned construction site a few kilometers from their village. At the spot where their home once stood, Esther and her family pick up the pieces.
There were about 20 armed men. They gathered around my house and thrashed all my crops. I constantly have nightmares about how brutal they were, burning everything in their way. They kept getting closer, burning all of the harvested crops and straw. They burned my home and everything I had.
For the past 6 months, the United Nations and aid agencies have repeatedly called for full humanitarian access to the Tigray region in the face of growing fears of a protracted conflict with devastating effects on civilians.
So this is a region that even prior to the conflict has been affected by shocks in recent years. We had the desert locust this past year, hailstorms, some pockets of the region that are already chronically affected by drought. It means that this is an area that's already a bit on the edge.
In a new report, a high-level UN-led committee estimated that about 350,000 people in the Tigray region are facing famine conditions. The war is now in its 7th month and has hampered access to essential services, food, water and livelihoods in large parts of Tigray region, putting the lives of millions at risk. UN staff in Tigray continue to report blocked movements of aid.
Consumer prices in the US are rising at their fastest pace in over a decade. In May, consumer prices were 0.6% higher than the previous month, but fully 5% higher than in May of last year, when the pandemic and lockdowns had thrust the US into recession. Among the elements driving that hot inflation, the rising cost of flights, household goods and clothing, as well as a 7.3% jump in the price of used cars. The core inflation rate, which removes volatile food and energy prices, rose 3.8% compared to last May. That's the biggest jump for that reading since 1992. The changes are linked to rising demand for goods and services and manufacturers passing along the higher costs of raw materials and transportation. The U.S. Central Bank targets steady inflation of around 2% and says the current spikes are likely to be temporary. If not, the Fed will face more pressure to raise interest rates and reduce stimulus in an effort to regain a balance. If inflation drastically outpaces wage increases, it can make life too expensive for workers. Separately, the number of Americans filing new claims for unemployment benefits fell last week to the lowest level in nearly 15 months. 376,000 new claims were recorded in the 6th straight week of declines.
As their parents struggle to put food on the table, almost 1 in 10 children around the world is missing out on schooling, helping their family make a living instead. For the first time in 2 decades, the world is seeing a rise in child labour.
We are losing ground in the fight to end child labour. Families are desperate and they're turning to child labour as a last resort.
A new UN report shows that an estimated 160 million children aged 5 to 17 were in child labour at the beginning of 2020, an increase of 8.4 million from 2016. That was before the pandemic. The global health crisis has since wiped away jobs and wages, throwing millions more people into poverty.
Unless we act to stop it, we could see a further increase in until the end of 2022. Some 9 million in child labour. This would take us further in the wrong direction.
Particularly worrying is the significant increase in the number of children in hazardous labour, defined as work that is likely to harm their health, safety or morals. However, not all work carried out by children is considered child labour. In this fishing village in Cambodia, a UN and government-backed programme is helping young people keep their education as well as work in a safer environment.
A
similar scheme is being run in Guatemala, where young people aged 14 to 29 are learning new skills to work in the local coffee industry. The idea is to improve the overall quality of livelihoods, to try and break the cycle of poverty and child labour.
Rochelle Harrison-Pless is keeping an eye on this story for us from Sydney. She joins us now from there. Rochelle, this sting was many years in the making. How were the Australian police implicated and able to catch some of these criminals?
Well, it was a joint effort by FBI agents and Australian police officers who reportedly devised this plan over a few beers back in 2018. Together, they were able to catch criminal underworld figures around the globe by tricking them into communicating via an encrypted app that the police themselves had designed, and it was the Australians who provided the technical capability. The app, known as Anom, was used by crime gangs to plan murders, mass drug importations and money laundering. Authorities say they were able to read some 25 million messages in real time, with criminals apparently using quite brazen language and making no effort to hide their illegal activities. In total, some 12,000 encrypted devices were used by 300 criminal syndicates in more than 100 countries.
It is truly incredible, the scale of all of this, and authorities say that it is going to be a truly massive blow to organised crime.
That's right. Operation Ironside, as it's known here in Australia, is the country's largest ever crime sting, involving more than 4,500 police officers here in Australia. They seized 45 million Australian dollars in cash and assets, 3.7 tonnes of drugs, hundreds of firearms, and they charged more than 220 people with over 500 offences. There have been arrests across 18 countries, and it's said that there are more to come. It's just shown how authorities were able to infiltrate the deepest, darkest corners of the criminal underworld. The app, the Anom, that the police themselves designed, gave law enforcement an edge that they never had, and it just led to this takedown on a massive scale that we've never seen before.
29 million. Well, you know what they say going once.
This is tourism for the rich, bidding to join Amazon founder Jeff Bezos in a 10-minute trip to space.
Thank you. And that is sold $28 million to number 107.
2, 1. This is the rocket New Shepard, launching for a test flight in April. Bezos' space company, Blue Origin, will carry its first humans into space aboard New Shepard on July 20th.
And we have liftoff. Go, New Shepard, go.
Inside the capsule will be Bezos, his brother, the yet-to-be-named auction winner, and a fourth anonymous person.
Let's get into what the flight itself is going to be like. It's about 10 times higher in altitude than your normal commercial jet flights over the Kármán line. That's when we're going to let our passengers unbuckle, get to experience about 3 minutes of weightlessness, the freedoms of zero G.
Worth almost $200 billion, Bezos is the world's richest man. He founded e-commerce giant Amazon in 1994, but announced this month his last day as CEO will be on July 5th. Bezos is now pivoting towards space.
This is Blue Moon. We've been working on this lander for 3 years. It's a very large lander. It's time to go back to the moon, this time to stay.
3, 2, 1. Well, the space race between world powers started decades ago. Billionaire investors have joined in recent years. Bezos is in competition with Virgin Galactic's Richard Branson and SpaceX's Elon Musk for the space tourism market. Bezos and Branson are developing short suborbital flights, meaning they do not reach speeds required to remain in Earth's orbit. Musk wants to do multi-day commercial space trips and has already sent astronauts to the International Space Station.
Engine restart.
But for now, Bezos is scheduled to be the first of the billionaires to take the trip himself. Charlotte Bellis, Al Jazeera.
A commuter van reduced to a burned-out shell in West Kabul. It was destroyed by a bomb. 30 minutes later, yet another transport van was hit. 2 separate attacks on one road, a few kilometers apart.
Unfortunately, the minivan was targeted. When I got here, I saw 2 wounded victims and dead bodies. We then took the injured to hospital.
Most of the people who live in this neighborhood of Kabul are from the Hazara ethnic community, who are predominantly Shia in a largely Sunni society. Armed groups linked to ISIL have declared war against them. There have been similar bombings in the area. Earlier this month, several civilians were killed when 4 minivans were bombed. And in May, about 80 people, mostly girls, were killed when their school was attacked. Hundreds of Afghans are killed or injured every month in attacks like these. People who live here are bracing for more violence.
From what I can see, the situation in the area is very critical and the number of casualties in this attack may increase. I still haven't been able to find my friend as his cell phone appears to be off.
Despite this rise in violence, Afghanistan is in the middle of a peace agreement. The U.S. says it will withdraw all its forces and that of NATO's by September 11th. It's a plan that's led to some tension among the allies in recent weeks. Negotiations between the Afghan government, the Taliban, and other parties have resumed in Qatar. But the violence back home appears to be escalating. Katia Lopez-Olayan, Al Jazeera.
During the worst of the pandemic, food banks across the U.S. were inundated with families in need of help. Many were facing food insecurity for the first time as businesses closed and jobs were lost. But even now, food banks remain in high demand. When Chef Peter Vote was approached by a South Florida food program to help, he didn't hesitate.
Today's meal, braised chicken and vegetables, jasmine rice, Caesar salad, and a beautiful piece of chocolate cake.
Feeding America, a non-profit group, projects that more than 40 million people may experience food insecurity in 2021, a number that includes 13 million children.
Hospitality is something that's been in my blood since I was very young, and this is part of hospitality. I enjoy this when I see the pictures of the people that are getting the food and the smiles on their faces. That makes me happy. That makes a hard week worthwhile.
Here we go. So much.
Volunteers from Food Rescue US take meals from restaurants and supermarkets across Miami. Sometimes it's food that would get thrown out. Instead, it's given to those that need it. Larita Santa Catarina used the service herself before volunteering and seeing how big the problem is.
Every time we would go and do the meal distributions, that we would always run out. We would be there for 2 hours and we would never stop. The line would never stop. And we would run out of food every time. There were always people left in need.
Supply chain issues and closures during the pandemic made the problem worse, meaning it will likely take time for food insecurity levels to recover. Groups like Food Rescue are focused on speeding that recovery up. According to the US Department of Agriculture, between 30 to 40% of all food is wasted every year. That's enough to feed around 25 million people. But with grassroots organizations like this and a network across the country, they can at least try and alleviate the problem. Even before the pandemic, food insecurity was a major issue, particularly in poorer communities. The US government's committed $1 billion to help, while volunteers continue to do their part in their own communities. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Miami Beach, Florida.
10 years after construction began, water is slowly beginning to rise in Ethiopia's flagship infrastructure project. The Grand Renaissance Dam, which is built on the Blue Nile, is set to power a landlocked country of 115 million people, more than half of whom are off the grid. But as Ethiopia prepares for the second phase of filling next month, countries downstream are once again protesting. But Ethiopian officials insist their plan is not unilateral.
3 countries have agreed on the schedule of filling. Let's say they have reached consensus. You know, there are scientists, 15 of them, 5 from each of the countries. In 2018, formulated a filling schedule. We're just following that filling schedule. This is not unilaterally developed by Ethiopia. It's developed by the 3 countries, the experts of the 3 countries. And you find that schedule in the draft agreements of Sudan, in the draft agreement of Egypt, and in the draft agreement of Ethiopia. In all documents, it is there.
Egyptian and Sudanese officials say that agreement was never signed and therefore not legally binding. Cairo and Khartoum have called for the United States, the United Nations, and the European Union to help reach a legally binding deal after an African Union-mediated process failed to reach an agreement. The deal will spell how the dam is operated and filled, based on international law and norms governing cross-border rivers. Egypt relies on the Nile for more than 90% of its water supplies. In March, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi warned his country's share of the Nile waters was untouchable and that there will be instability in the region if Ethiopia fills the reservoir without an international agreement. Ethiopia says the 5 billion dam is essential and that the vast majority of its population lacks electricity.
Ethiopia is in darkness. 60% of Ethiopians do not have access to electricity. And those who have access to electricity is in a very small distribution, a very small power that goes to each house. And Ethiopia is really very much in need of developing the country, industrialization, urban development, and bringing electricity to rural cities and areas so that, this power will be, instrument of supporting agro-processing, other development needs.
Addis Ababa says security at the dam has been stepped up and the Air Force is actively protecting the airspace over it. The announcement follows recent military exercises by Egyptian and Sudanese forces. Egypt has also signed military cooperation pacts with Ethiopia's neighbors, Kenya and Djibouti. The row over Ethiopia's dam has security implications for the entire region. Ethiopia accuses Sudan and Egypt of dragging their feet constantly over the issue of filling up the dam, something it says both countries knew would be inevitable one day. Mohammed Ado, Al Jazeera, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Well, meanwhile, hundreds of websites, including major news organisations and the British government, have now started to work again after going offline for about an hour. An outage at a cloud services company is thought to have been to blame. The sites affected include the New York Times, CNN, The Guardian and Bloomberg News. The San Francisco-based company Fastly, which hosts the websites, says it's now fixed the problem. Well, let's now speak to Jodie Westby. She is the Chief Executive of Global Cyber Risk. She joins us now from Washington, D.C. Jodie, how does something like this happen?
Well, the good news is this was not a cyber attack as far as we know. This was a configuration problem. It was a configuration service problem, and they fixed that, and we're back up. So it was a glitch in their system, but it shows how interconnected we all are and how one problem, even in one small place, can ripple through and spread across the globe and impact, millions of internet users.
Well, Jodie, so many of the biggest websites in the world are, by my understanding, dependent on just a few of these cloud servicing companies. That all sounds rather fragile. Can you explain how that all works?
Think of it as a sandwich. So you have the main service provider like Google or New York Times or Guardian, and then you have the meat on the sandwich. and on top you have the customer. So Fastly is like the meat in a sandwich. It is there to take the content and deliver it very fast to the consumer, to the user up above. And Fastly was impacted. So the meat in the sandwich went away, and then the customer couldn't connect. And so it was a service that is a very important service in delivering content around the world. And it was disrupted again because of this configuration setting. And it impacted all these people because it was such a critical layer in the service delivery.